Welcome to another crochet tutorial with Cozy Rosie UK. Today I'm going to be showing you how you can crochet your very own granny stripe scrap blanket, using up all those odds and ends, those half balls of yarn that you have, and putting them all to really good use to create your very own super cozy blankets. Now we are going to be working with 2 strands of yarn together, so it also works as a great stash buster if you've got loads of yarn that maybe you bought on sale or you just accumulated over the few months you've been crocheting. I'm going to show you how we can use all of those up. Now before we get started, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and of course the notification bell so that you never miss out on another one of my crochet tutorials again. Let's gather some of the materials we're going to be needing. Firstly, you're going to need a knitter's ruler or a gauge square or just a ruler or a measuring tape. Ideally something that's firm, that doesn't move, that you can hold against your fabric. Now you only need this if you want to be 100% accurate about the size of your blanket that you're making. If you're just using up yarn, you don't need to worry about that step too much. You can get together all your scrap yarns, those half balls, get them all together so you can get some kind of idea of what colours you've got, but you don't need to be accurate with your colours. This can be as wild and as bold as you want it to be. What you will find is over on my blog is a printable version of this pattern, so you can go ahead and head on over to the blog. I've put the link in the description box below for you, so you can print off and keep your own copy, which has all the information you need as well. I'm going to be working using 2 strands of 100% acrylic together. Now these are both chunky weight yarn and I'm going to be using a 12mm crochet hook with this. Now obviously you may be a bit of trial and error to get the right hook size that's going to work for your yarn that you're using. So I have put on my blog a chart that you can have a look where you're holding double strands, what the recommended hook size is. So perhaps if you're using 2 strands of DK weight yarn size 3, you could use a 6mm or an 8mm hook. And of course that means that our blankets are going to work up very, very quickly. What I would recommend is that you use 2 strands of the same fibre so that you can ensure they've got the same care and wash instructions. Obviously, if you've got a 20% wool and a 80% acrylic against 100% acrylic, it's going to perhaps cause a little bit of problems when you use and wash your blanket. So the first thing we're going to do is work out how big we want our blanket to be. Again, over on the blog, I'll link all of this in the description box, don't worry, you will find a blanket chart. Now I'm just going to be making quite a lap gown, which is designed for me anyway. I like to use them on the sofa, so it's just kind of me that's covered rather than a large throw. So mine's going to be about 40 inches by 60 inches wide. So you will need a tape measure so you can measure your chain for the simplest way. Or if you want to be exact about how big your blanket's going to end up, you will need to measure your gauge. So this pattern is incredibly simple. It is just a 1-row repeat. And as I said earlier, you can get hold of the actual downloadable printable PDF over on my blog as well. We're going to get started by making our chain for the blanket. Now you can go and make the chain as long as you want. If you are simply measuring your chain for the width of your blanket, give it a bit of a stretch. I'll show you as I make my gauge swatch just how much that will stretch as you start. So you're going to need a tape measure as well if you're measuring with that. Or if you're following along to make a gauge swatch, we're going to start by making a chain of 24, which of course is 21, which is divisible by 3, and 3 extra. Just checking my maths in my head then. So to make our slip knot, we're simply going to create a loop, bring that working yarn behind and pull through, pop that onto our hook, and then by pulling our working yarn to tighten that against our hook, not too tight now. It's really important to remember that you need to make sure that both loops of your 2 strands go through your hook and through the stitch every single time. So we're going to chain 24. So we yarn over the hook, and you will notice that I'm holding my yarn a little bit loosely because these are big stitches and we need to make sure that it's flowing through our fingers loosely. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So you can either continue to follow along to make your gauge swatch, or you can just make your chain as long as you want, making sure that that number is divisible by 3. $23 and $24. So my stitch count is 24, which is divisible by 3, but I've gone for 21 plus 3. Now, as you can see, I've just pulled my chain a little bit there, and you can see just how stretchy it is. So if you are making your beginning chain and you're just going to measure that for the width of your blanket, say you want to make it 30 inches wide, do give it a gentle stretch as you're measuring it, because it will expand as you start working into it. So going into row 1, I'm going to suggest that you work into the back bump of your chain. So normally we would go in under both loops of our chain, but in this instance, I'd recommend you work into the bumps for the perfect edge of your blanket. So we've got the top loop here that we never work into. So that's number 1, number 2, there's number 3. So these 3 we're not going to work into. We're going to start by working into number 4. And I'm going to go under the back. So you can see there's your normal V's that we count. And we flip it over, we've got a little bump, and we're going to work into that initially. So this chain 3 does count as a double crochet in US terms, or a treble crochet in UK terms. And we're going to place in the 4th chain from hook 1 double crochet in US terms, or 1 treble crochet in UK terms, double crochet in US terms. So we simply yarn over the hook, insert your hook into that back bump of the chain. We're going to yarn over, bring a loop up, yarn over, pull through, making sure that you've still got 2 loops of yarn from your working yarn, and then yarn over and pull through those 2 loops. And then we're going to chain 1. So that chain 1 allows us to skip a stitch or a chain, but we're actually going to skip 2 for this part. So 1, 2 back bumps. If you're working through the chains, skip 2 chains. So 1, 2, and we're going to work into this 3rd one here, placing 3 double crochets or 3 treble crochets. So yarn over the hook, go through that back bump, yarn over, bring a loop up, pull through 2, pull through 2. Now we're going to place a further 2 treble crochets all into this same stitch. So where we've just worked, we're going to go back into that space and place another 2 doubles or 2 trebles. There we go. Making sure we've gone through all those strands. And that creates our first granny stitch or a granny cluster, depending on what you know it as. In between each of our granny clusters, we're going to chain 1, and we're going to repeat this the whole way down the length of our chain. So we skip 2 and work into the 3rd one, placing 3 double crochets or 3 treble crochets in UK terms all the way down. And this is all the way to the very last 2 chains, because obviously we're skipping 2, so we don't want to skip those 2 last ones. We're going to do something a little bit different at the end. There we go, so that's number 2, number 3. Going to chain 1, skip 2, and work into that 3rd one there. If you ever lose your bumps, you can flip your chain back over and see where your chains are, and make sure you're working into the right one. Okay. Oh, I didn't yarn over, sorry, there we go. So we're going to place 3 treble crochets and chain 1 in between all the way to the last 2 stitches, making sure that we skip those 2 chains in between, and that gives us the nice spaces between them. You're going to see as you're working this, your chain looks a little bit messy, but I promise When you give it a pull at the end, it all straightens out. And by working into those back bumps, it gives you that lovely finished edge without having to place one there if you don't want to. So remembering to chain one in between each of those granny clusters or granny stitches, continue working all the way down your chain, skipping 2 chains, working 3 treble crochets in UK terms, 3 double crochets into the 1 stitch, and then chain 1. Repeat that all the way down, and I'll meet you at the end of row 1. So I've just completed my last granny cluster, chain 1, and I've got 2 chains remaining. Now I'm going to skip this one here, then in my last chain, so you can see that it's my last one, there's my original slip knot, we're going to work 1 double crochet or 1 treble crochet in UK terms into that last remaining chain. So we skip 1 and work 1 remaining in that last chain, and that completes row 1. You can see how much that's got bigger, that chain, hasn't it? Even though it's not any bigger. So now that we've done row 1, we are going to very simply do the same for row 2. So we're going to chain 3, which counts as a stitch, and turn our work. You can chain before you turn or chain after, it's entirely up to you. So these 3 chains count as a double crochet, and the first stitch that we're going to place is actually into the same stitch where we've worked this chain. So normally when a chain counts as a stitch, you wouldn't always work into the same stitch, you'd work into the next. But in this instance, we're going to work into the same. So it works out that we have the equivalent of 2 double crochets into the same stitch. So where we've got that little gap underneath the chain, you see your stitch there, we're just going to place another double crochet or treble crochet for UK in that same spot. We're going to chain 1, and we're going to go and work into this chain space here. So we simply yarn over, insert the hook into that chain space. We're not going to work into this one, we're going into that next chain space there, and to yarn over and place 3 double crochets or 3 treble crochets into that same chain space. Ooh. Trebles, not halves. Come on you go. Challenges with when you've got 2 loops, it's hard to correct slip stitches. There we go. Making sure we're grabbing both loops. That's 2. And that is 3. And then we're going to chain 1. So exactly the same as we did. So what I would say is, you may notice that I'm struggling to get the tension right on this. And this is one of the biggest challenges of working with 2 strands of yarn, is that, of course, you need to keep the tension even on both strands of one yarn that you're working. Because if you don't, you may get the odd loop coming through or some crazy kind of stitch pointing, poking out when you don't want it to be. So we're just going to continue. Did I chain 1? I did. Making sure that we chain 1 in between these stitches. So we do 3 and chain 1. And then we work into that next chain space all the way along, and working in that last chain space as well, just before we get to the end. So keep on repeating that all the way across your first row for row 2, and I'll meet you just after you've finished that last chain space. So I've just completed my last cluster into that last chain space, going to chain 1 as we've done throughout. And this time, instead of working into the top of the stitch we have here, we're going to work into the top of our turning chain. So you've got 1, 2, 3, and that's where we need to place our hook. So I kind of flip mine to the side, yarn over, ensuring that I pick up 4 loops of the top of that chain 3, yarn over and complete your double crochet or your treble crochet as normal. See what happens when you drop. So as you can see, that's the end of row 2, and already mine is feeling lovely and squishy and soft. But this gives us an idea of how big our blanket is going to be. To complete your gauge swatch and to do all the calculations, you will need to fill your gauge swatch. Now, obviously, you don't need to make it quite as long as I have, but I wanted to get you used to this technique of these stitches. Some of the other things I wanted to show you was, obviously, you can see with some of the scrap yarn I have here, I have tiny scrap, big ones. So let's pretend I'm going to change colour. So obviously you have absolute freedom as to when you change colours, what colours you use, all that wonderful stuff. But let's say I want to change over to adding in some of this purple. Now I'm only changing one colour. So normally when we change colour, when we have one strand, for instance, we would simply, well, the simplest way is just to yarn over, pull that colour through, and then in this instance, we're not going to pull both strands, we're just going to pull the colour we're changing. We can then pop that other loop of the other colour back onto the hook and kind of make sure that all the tension is even before we carry on. So then you would do with row 2, just as you did with row 3. No, row 3, you're going to do the same as you did with row 2 by starting with a chain 3. And then we continue our pattern as normal. So we're going to work our treble crochet into the top in the same stitch that we did our chain 3. And then we just chain 1 and continue to work into each of these chain spaces, doing a chain 1 in between of those 3 treble crochets. When we get to the end, we simply place 1 treble crochet into the top of that turning chain. So the top of that chain 3, we place our final treble crochet. So that is how you're going to make your blanket. Very simply, continue and repeat row 2 for as long as you want your blanket to be. When you make your starting chain, you can do a rough estimate, making sure that it's divisible by 3. And then you work into that 4th chain from hook. Now don't forget, you can get a copy of the printable pattern over on my website. I will pop that link in the description box for you as well. And go bold with your colour choices. See if I can reach mine. Hang on. I haven't woven in all my ends yet, but you can see that you can go as wild as you want them to be. So I've got my washed teal with my dusty lilac. I've got some cream and some ballet pink. I've got ballet pink and grey. So almost what I've done is changed 1 or 2 colours every 2 rows. And yes, that's given me a lot of ends to weave in, but I think it looks absolutely beautiful and it's so squishy. So keep on going. If you want more information as to how to calculate your gauge, you can head over onto the blog as well. You'll find a full tutorial on the YouTube channel on how to measure your gauge as well. If you want to make an exact blanket size, there is of course a blanket size chart over on the blog and included on that free printable download as well. Wow, we covered a lot today. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm going to go and add an edging onto my blanket. Again, all that information is linked in the pattern for you, and you can find how to add a border onto a granny square in my YouTube channel as well. Why not? I'll link that below for you as well. Of course, finally, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, give it a thumbs up if you've enjoyed this pattern, and of course, tell your friends that this free pattern is available for them. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I'll see you all again soon.